Good evening, and thanks for joining us. Welcome to Heritage Hour. As things are beginning to slowly open up again, we are so pleased that you have chosen to join us online this evening. My name is Erin D. Richard, and I am the Curator Supervisor at the Oil Museum of Canada National Historic Site. We're located in the village of Oil Springs, Ontario, and are the home of the first commercial oil well in North America. I'll be your moderator tonight for the Heritage Hour presentation on the Lamb in Lambton. With me are representatives from the Heritage Sarnia-Lambton Museum Network. I'm so pleased to welcome heritage professionals from across Lambton County for this digital presentation. It's the 5th Heritage Hour talk that we've done as a group since the COVID-19 pandemic began. If you want to see the previous recordings, you can access them online at heritagelambton.ca or on the Lambton County Archives YouTube channel. I'll be recording tonight's presentation, so if you want to watch it again or share it with your friends and family, you're welcome to do so, and it'll be online. We'll send an e-blast with the link to everyone that registered tonight in the next few days. So tonight, our panelists of historians and museum professionals from across Lambton County will be sharing an assortment of events from a variety of different locations. We will explore stories of notorious criminals, kidnappings, robberies, and smugglings that have taken place in our communities, from the scofflaws to the downright illegal. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And you can also use the chat box to make comments and talk with the other attendees. Just be sure that you're sending your message to all attendees and not just panelists if you want everyone to see it. You can start off tonight by chatting in the chat box by sharing where you're from. It's always fascinating for us to see how far our reach can go outside of Ontario. Tonight's presentation will be about an hour long, and I will be introducing each presenter as we go. We will finish with Q&A and some updates from our community museums. I'm so grateful for our panelists that have joined us tonight to share their knowledge and continue providing great programming while our museums are closed. If you love the presentation tonight, keep your eyes peeled to register for our final Heritage Hour of the year, taking place on October 21st, Lambton's Haunted History. And a final note of warning before we dive into our first speaker. Due to the subject theme, there will potentially be disturbing content presented that might include graphic references to violence and sexual assault, so please be advised. All right, so let's begin. First up, we have Dana Thorne. Dana is the Curator Supervisor at Lambton Heritage Museum. She previously worked as the archivist at the Lambton County Archives. Take it away, Dana.
Thank you, Erin, and thanks everyone for being here tonight. I am going to share my screen and present. Perfect. So it's my pleasure to be here tonight, and it's been really fun to do the research to help prepare for this talk. I get to talk about a really dramatic event in our local history that has all the makings of a Hollywood movie, including unforgettable gangster nicknames, ransom notes, and a beer tycoon. Fortunately, the story also has a relatively happy ending. We can't fully appreciate the story I'm going to tell tonight without first shifting our gaze to a tall, frothy pint and reflecting a bit on the history of Canada's largest brewery, the Labatt Brewing Company. John Kinder Labatt was an Irish immigrant who founded the Labatt Brewing Company right here in southwestern Ontario in London in 1847. After John Kinder passed away in 1866, his son John assumed control of the company. Under John's direction, the Labatt Brewing Company grew to be the largest brewery in Canada. After he died in 1915, the company was run by a trust overseen by his 9 children. It was his sons, John Sackville Labatt and Hugh Francis Labatt, that assumed managerial control of the operations. The Labatt Brewing Company had survived the lean Prohibition years when many other breweries had failed, and so by the mid-1930s, John Sackville Labatt was one of the wealthiest brewers in Canada. He also has the unfortunate privilege of going down in history as Canada's first wealthy businessman to be held for ransom. His kidnapping took place in 1934, in the middle of the Great Depression. During the desperation and poverty of the 1930s, kidnapping was an opportunity to profit from the super rich who prospered while the rest of the country starved. In his book, The Kidnap Years, David Stott wrote, "There were so many kidnappings in Depression-era America that newspapers listed the less sensational cases in small type, the way real estate transactions or baseball trades were rendered. There were so many kidnappings that some public officials wondered aloud if they were witnessing an epidemic. In fact, they were. And it wasn't just south of the border that these kidnappings were occurring. Back here in Lambton County, it was the second week of August, 1934, and John Sackville Labatt had just finished a relaxing visit to the shores of Lake Huron. He had been visiting a historic summer house and estate in Brights Grove called Faithorn House. This beautiful property was originally owned by Colonel Faithorn, commander of the Essex, Kent, and Lambton forces during the Fenian raids. The historic building is still standing today and is now the location of the Brights Grove Library and Gallery in the Grove. Labatt left Faithorn House that morning for a meeting in London. He drove through Camlackey and decided to take a shortcut through Warwick, reportedly because he was running late for the meeting he needed to get to in London. Unfortunately, he would never reach his destination. Labatt spotted a fast-traveling, suspicious vehicle on the Egremont Road. He was relieved when the vehicle passed him, but then saw it rounding a corner and coming straight for him. Labatt's vehicle stopped dead to avoid the collision. 3 men emerged from the other car, and one pointed a gun at Labatt's head and ordered him to exit the vehicle. Labatt was commanded to write a note to his brother Hugh, asking him to cooperate with the kidnappers. On the back of John's plea to his brother, the kidnappers laid out their ransom demands. The original ransom note can be seen on this slide, and it's now part of the collection at the Western University Archives. The chilling note reads, "Mr. Hugh Labatt, we are holding your brother John for $150,000 ransom." That's about $2.5 million in today's dollars. "Go to Toronto immediately and register at the Royal York Hotel. We will negotiate with you from that point. Be prepared when I get in touch with you there to furnish me the names of 2 or 3 reliable parties who you can trust to deliver this money to us. We advise you to keep this matter away from the police and the newspapers so as we can return your brother safely. You will know me as 3-Fingered Abe." The kidnappers hoped that John's brother Hugh would pay for his safe return and keep the matter quiet. One of the kidnappers phoned Hugh and told him to go to London's Victoria Hospital, where Hugh found his brother's car with the ransom note pinned to the upholstery. In the meantime, 3-Fingered Abe and his crew drove to their cottage hideout north of London in the Muskokas. There, Labatt was blindfolded and reportedly fastened to a bed with a dog chain. Well, the matter did not stay out of the newspapers. Headlines raged across the province reporting the incident. The headlines on this slide came from the Sarnia-Canadian Observer on August 14th and 15th. The kidnappers kept John Labatt chained and blindfolded in their Muskoka hideaway cottage as they panicked about what to do, while media scrutiny about the case increased. Reporters were flooding to the Royal York Hotel, where the kidnappers were supposed to meet Hugh for the money transfer. After 3 days of confinement, the kidnappers decided that Labatt had become too much of a liability and there was too much media and police attention on the case. So at 12:30 a.m. on August 17th, John was released in Toronto at the corner of Vaughan Road and St. Clair Avenue, close to the Royal York Hotel where his brother was waiting. Susan Goldenberg recounts in her book on the kidnapping called Snatched, the kidnappers removed Labatt's blindfold and gave him cab fare for the ride downtown, $1 out of the $99 stolen from his wallet. When the battered Labatt finally reached the Royal York Hotel, he waded through a mob of reporters and policemen unnoticed to reach the front desk. When he asked the receptionist for his brother's room number, he was suddenly recognized by a reporter, and everyone in the room erupted when they realized he was there. So what happened to the kidnappers at the end of this incident? 3 men were arrested and charged for the kidnapping. One of the men arrested was David Meisner, a small-town gambler from Kentucky who was identified by Labatt from a series of mugshots. At Meisner's trial, Labatt looked him in the eye and swore, "That's the man, there in the box. He left a picture in my mind I shall never forget." The stirring testimony landed Meisner in jail in spite of his excellent lawyer and his alibi. However, they had the wrong man. In 1936, Piccolo Pete Murray was pinned as one of the Labatt kidnappers, and Meisner was retried with a verdict of not guilty. He later sued and settled for $5,500, which is about $95,000 today. And what about our victim, John Sackville Labatt? Even though he escaped this incident without any real physical harm, the episode shook him deeply. He became reclusive and withdrawn after the kidnapping and could never shake the memory of what he had endured. Reports are that he was never really the same again after the incident. However, his legacy lives on in the Labatt beers we continue to enjoy today. The Labatt Company introduced an anniversary ale in 1950 to commemorate when John and his brother Hugh joined the company in 1900. It was later renamed Labatt 50 and became an iconic Canadian beer. During Canada's sesquicentennial in 2017, it was temporarily renamed Labatt 150 to celebrate Canada's 150th birthday. If you want to learn more about the Labatt Brewing Company, Western University Archives has all of Labatt's corporate records and has put together a wonderful virtual exhibit about the company. I'll put the link in the chat here if anyone is interested in checking it out. So the next time you sip a Labatt 50 or you drive down the Egremont Road, take a minute to recall the extraordinary kidnapping of John Sackville Labatt and its intimate connection to Lambton County. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dana. Who knew there was so much history behind the beer? All right. So next up, we have Nicole. Nicole Aszalos is the archivist supervisor at the Lambton County Archives, which is located in Wyoming, Ontario. Nicole holds a Bachelor of Honors in Classical Archaeology with a minor in Ancient Languages and postgraduate certificates in Museum and Gallery Studies and Creative Writing. Go ahead, Nicole.
Thank you, Erin. I'm just going to share my screen here. I don't know if you see, or if you're going to see the full PowerPoint. Do you see the slideshow?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm working off one monitor tonight, so thank you, everyone. So like Dana's story, mine is going to be in the Depression era. However, unlike Dana's story, it doesn't exactly have a happy ending. So tonight I'm going to be talking about the robbery of Red Ryan in Sarnia, Ontario. And we're going to start off with Constable Jack Lewis. So George Edward John Lewis was born December 24th, 1902 to George and Goldie in Sarnia Township. Known widely as Jack by his friends and colleagues, Jack Lewis was constable on the 14-man Sarnia Police Department since April 1st, 1929. Within his first year of service, Constable Lewis was commended by the Sarnia Police Commission for his smart work causing the arrest of a man convicted of theft. 3 years later, while patrolling Maxwell Street, he spotted two individuals breaking into an M&P store. Without backup, Lewis arrested them both, earning another merit mark from the commission. He even made national news in 1933 when he risked his life running into a burning business to rescue the cash and purse of the proprietor. Now, Norman J. Ryan, also known as Red Ryan from the copper color hair, was often described as an individual with the face of an angel and the heart of the devil. Ryan was born in Chicago in 1895 and moved to Toronto with his family at a very young age. As a teenager, he was running his own street gang, burglarizing homes and businesses. Ultimately, he graduated to bank robberies and armed holdups across Southern Ontario, Quebec, and the American Midwest. The life of crime caught up and he was incarcerated on numerous occasions. During the final stint in jail at Kingston Penitentiary, he took on the appearance of sainthood. He was a model prisoner, regularly sermonizing to other convicts on the foolishness of a life of crime. His newfound goodness was picked up by the Toronto Star by a reporter who just so happened to be one of his childhood friends, and he wrote about this poor reformed criminal now needlessly confined to prison. When Prime Minister Bennett toured the penitentiary in 1935, he met Ryan, who spun a story designed to impress the Prime Minister and also melt his heart. Shortly after, civic leaders, prison reformers, and the general public increasingly called for mercy on this prisoner. Red Ryan was released. He was showered with job offers, photo ops with police chief, mayors, and celebrities. He appeared at grand openings and events across the city, even acquiring his own radio show, which he used to rail against the tragedy of a life of crime. Essentially, Red Ryan was everywhere. Now, what wasn't known during this time was that he also quietly reassembled his gang and resumed burglaries across the province. From October 1935 to May 1936, his gang had committed so many armed robberies that the Toronto police formed a special task force to figure out what was happening. On Saturday of the May long weekend in 1936, Special Constable Jack Lewis was scheduled to be on duty at 6 p.m. in the Sarnia Police Station. As Lewis prepared for work that day, Red Ryan and his partner in crime, Harry Shepley, were on their way to Sarnia dressed as railway men in stolen Oldsmobile to commit another heist. At 5:58 p.m., a report came in. It was by William McLean, a taxi driver, about a holdup at Liquor Store 46. Now there's shift change time and the number of officers that were on, it was shift change time and a number of officers were on hand at the station. They were either starting their shifts or leaving. 4 officers immediately responded, including Jack, who had arrived for his shift early, as he regularly liked to do. So they reached the scene in the police department's only cruiser at the precise moment Ryan and Shepley were leaving with their haul. The liquor store had an indoor and an outdoor, both facing Christina Street. Finding that the indoor was locked, officers McGurr, Smith, and Lewis rushed in through the outdoor, while Officer Simpkins remained outside guarding both doors. Hearing the commotion, Red Ryan hurried to the stairs, a gun in both hands, and fired 4 shots, striking the chest of Constable Lewis, who was in the lead. Lewis fell, and a violent gun battle ensued. Shepley was hit several times and lay near death at the entrance stairwell. Ryan ran for the indoor, which wouldn't unlock, and Detective McGurr fired a shot, hitting him in the leg. Then officers fired several more, hitting Red Ryan multiple times. The mortally wounded Jack Lewis was carried through the crowd of onlookers to the police car, which took him to Sarnia Hospital. Jack Lewis's wife, Vera, met him there, and she clung to his side as doctors worked to save him. Unfortunately, they could not. 45 minutes after Constable Jack Lewis reported for work, he died, becoming the first officer killed in the line of duty in the history of the Sarnia Police Department. Early Tuesday afternoon, a private service for Constable Lewis was held at his home, followed by a public service at Parker Street United Church. Over 2,500 attended the funeral, which spilled into the church basement and grounds. He was laid to rest in Blackwell Cemetery and was survived by his wife, Vera, and 2 children. Red Ryan's body was returned by train to a shocked Toronto. The Toronto Star remained silent about this event. Ryan was refused the last rites of the Catholic Church, and his body was interred at Mount Hope Cemetery. In 2018, a bronze memorial plaque commemorating Constable Lewis was affixed to the exterior of the building near Christina and Cromwell Streets in Sarnia, where the shootout occurred. And I'm just going to end my screen sharing here. And I just wanted to share, to end this part of the presentation, that I gathered a lot of this material from Phil Egan's new book. It's called Keeping the Peace, 160 Years of Policing of the Imperial City. And if you're interested, it's available for purchase from the Sarnia Historical Society, the Bookkeeper in Sarnia, and soon the Lambton County Archives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicole. All right, so next up, we have Laurie Mason. Laurie has been the curator of Moore Museum for 35 years. She holds a Bachelor of Arts and a Bachelor of Education degrees from Brock University, as well as a certificate in museum studies from the Ontario Museum Association. Moore Museum began in 1975 in the former Moortown School and has grown over the past 45 years to a 13-building community museum showcasing the social, agricultural, and marine history of the former Moore Township section of St. Clair Township. Laurie, you can go ahead and start.
Okay, thanks, Erin. Good evening, everyone. Let me see if I can manage to share my screen. Okay, there we go. I've entitled my presentation Crime Through Time because I'm looking at thefts that occurred 130 years apart. Apparently there was something of the Wild West in Canada West, as this tale of crime and what was then Moore Township indicates. The source for this story is the Pioneer Annals of Moore Township, written by Roland C. Whitted, and these were originally published in the Brigden Progress newspaper in 1914. So perhaps the best way to operate illegally without detection is to hide behind a legitimate business, and that's what the Missouri, Illinois, and Eastern Trading Company did in the 1830s and 1840s. The company operated in the United States along the south shore of Lake Erie and in Ontario from the Detroit and St. Clair rivers across to Niagara. At first, the company made use of the Talbot Road, but as the number of settlers increased, they had to move to less visible locations. So within this operating area, the company would rent pasture and bush in isolated areas. And to establish themselves in people's mind as a legitimate horse trading company, they would purchase a few horses using cash. But the other part of the business was the stealing of horses. So in the isolated southeast corner of what was then Moore Township, Lot 1, Concession 1, you can see it marked in yellow there on this map. They rented land from John Adams, and it's believed that John Adams did not know the actual nature of the business that they were conducting there. It's not too hard to imagine when you see this picture of what Lot 1, Concession 1 looks like today, that at the time it was described as unbroken wilderness. And heading up the Traders Transportation Department was Lauren McDougall. To carry out the transporting of horses, McDougall had a steam scow fitted out as a cordwood carrier. So the fore and aft decks actually were legitimately for cordwood, but the hold would hold 20 horses. So from John Adams Farm and Moore, the traders route went up Black Creek, pictured here, to Oil Springs, and then along trails to an area known as Poplar Maze. It's near Kilworth, and it was several square miles in size, and it was referred to as a maze because the sandy soil was covered with clumps of trees and bushes, and a lot of similar looking clumps interspersed with years of horse and cattle hooves leaving marks, made for a very difficult area to navigate through. McDougall trained his men to effortlessly find their way anyway through this maze, but their pursuers were frequently losing a lot of time getting lost in the area. In the 1840s, on a September night, the traders paid a visit to the Moortown farm of Raymond Bobby, leaving with a pair of Bobby's black horses. When Bobby discovered them missing in the morning, he set out after them, but was immediately confronted with a dilemma. One horse had clearly been taken upstream and the other down. Bobby must have been somewhat familiar with the operations of this traders going on in the area, though, because he knew they were headed to the Niagara area. So instead of attempting to follow one horse or the other, he headed for Niagara. The 250-mile trek to Niagara was accomplished by Bobby in only 3 days by foregoing sleep and trading out his horses regularly. The authorities were alerted, and they patrolled the Niagara River while they sent a posse, including Bobby, to watch the Lake Erie shoreline. An unusual boat was spotted offshore by one of the watchmen, so the posse arrived at that spot, but not until after a number of the horses had already been loaded onto the scow. Seeing the posse coming, McDougall's crew headed for the boat without the last 6 horses. Fortunately for Bobby, his 2 horses were among those that were left behind. In 1847, an attempt was made to arrest McDougall at John Adams' house. However, he had prepared himself for such an eventuality, having loosened some of the roof boards, allowing him to escape by jumping out over the heads of the authorities. Later, an arrest was successful, McDougall having been found at a cousin's house near Wallaceburg. An officer was injured by gunshot but survived, found guilty of horse stealing and shooting with intent at his May 1848 trial. McDougall was sentenced to 8 years in Kingston Penitentiary. By 1850, the increased population in the area and the ability to share news via telegraph caused the disbanding of the Missouri, Illinois, and Eastern Trading Company. This next tale of robbery takes place quite a long time later, in 1971. This one is of personal interest to me because I recall it from my childhood. This incident involves the Brigden Community Credit Union. I apologize for the quality of the picture there. It's just a reprint of a newspaper photo, but the color photo shows the same location today, just to give you a sense of place. On the night of July 31st, 1971, when I was almost 8 years old, my family was awakened by the sound of frantic banging on our front door. My dad opened the door to find my distraught next door neighbor on the porch asking to use the telephone because his phone line had been cut. Our neighbor, Orest Horlick, was the manager of the credit union. And after calling the police, he filled my dad in on what had happened. 3 masked men, armed with knives and guns, had broken into his home. Tying up his wife and daughter, the thieves took him to the credit union and forced him to open the safe. Back at Mr. Horlick's home, the thieves tied him up also and stole his car as an escape vehicle. The robbers fled with reported $4,000, and later the car was found abandoned near the intersection of Plank and Indian Roads in Sarnia. Since at that young age I wasn't reading the newspapers, I didn't realize until I started researching for this evening that this was actually the second robbery of the Brigden Community Credit Union in just over a year. On May 26, 1970, the previous manager was a victim of a robbery using the same MO, breaking into the manager's home while his phone line had been cut. In this incident, Roland, known as Huck Campbell, and his wife Grace awoke in their home on Oil Springs Line to 3 men wearing makeshift masks and carrying knives and sawed-off shotguns. Mrs. Campbell was tied up and guarded while the thieves took Mr. Campbell to the credit union and forced him to open the vault. They returned him to his home after obtaining $2,000 from the safe. After the Campbells freed themselves from their bonds, they walked a quarter mile to where Mr. Campbell's brother Donald lived, and they called the police from there, as the thieves had thrown away the keys to their own vehicle as they left. The report on this robbery also referred back to another theft in Brigden, this one just 3 months earlier. This one occurred at the Bank of Nova Scotia rather than the credit union. This obviously is a much older photo, given the horse and carriage and the fact that it's so called the Metropolitan Bank, but it shows the building rather nicely. The February 18th, 1970 theft here was a similar MO, but only 2 thieves were reported on that occasion. The bank manager, Robert Janelle, lived with his wife and 3 children in the apartment above the bank. And the family was held hostage all night because at the bank, the safe was controlled by a time release mechanism. So once the safe could be opened in the morning, the family was taken downstairs and the arriving employees were forced to lie on the floor. After obtaining a reported $40,000, the thieves locked the family and the employees in the safe. And fortunately, after the thieves left, Mr. Janelle was able to open the vault from inside to release them. Perhaps not surprisingly, when the new bank was built in 1979, they didn't build a second floor with an apartment on it. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find any more information to find out if any of these thieves were ever apprehended. But fortunately, however, the introduction of time delay safes and other safety features have relegated this style of bank robbery to the past. Thank you.
Thanks, Laurie. Interesting, harrowing stories about being bank managers. All right. Next, we have David McLean. David is a retired high school history teacher who taught for 31 years and is currently a volunteer with the Forest Museum and the Plimpton, Wyoming Museums. He holds an honors BA in history from Huron College and a Bachelor of Education from Althouse Teachers College. So David, you can go ahead and start sharing your screen.
Okay. All right, thanks very much, and hello to everyone out there. So, before I dive into the crime story I'm going to share with you, I'd like you to think for a moment about the word you see on the screen right now, tramp. And I'd like to ask, what ideas or images does the word bring to mind for you? Did it bring this to mind? That's a little too romantic for tonight, so forget that one. How about this image? Okay, this is, of course, the iconic image of silent film era star Charlie Chaplin, his most beloved role, the Tramp. If you're familiar with The Tramp, you'll know that this role was a work of pure comic genius by Chaplin. At the same time, you will likely recall that in the Tramp movies, Chaplin's character was typically treated unfairly with contempt and distrust by most of the other characters, including the police officers. So the reason I have started my presentation with this particular image is that back in the late 19th century, during a time of economic instability known as the Long Depression, the label of tramp or hobo was applied disparagingly to any young man who was one of many thousands of unemployed individuals who drifted from town to town in search of work or handouts. With no such thing as a social safety net, no welfare, no employment insurance, no minimum wage, such individuals were forced to eke out an existence as best they could. Many followed the railway lines that often provided the shortest routes between urban areas, and also some free transportation, if they could sneak, illegally of course, aboard a freight train. In 1897, someone took the time one day to count the number of so-called tramps aboard a freight train that had pulled into Forest. They counted 20 in total. Life as a tramp could be very difficult, and their efforts to survive often result in brushes with the law and, inevitably, conflict among their ranks. So my crime story concerns a man who was identified as a tramp and who was believed to have been murdered by other tramps. Somewhere near the spot in this photo, just a little to the west of Forest. This is a very popular walking trail today. Along this trail were once laid the tracks of the Grand Trunk Railway. Along here, the body of a man was discovered at 9 o'clock in the morning on Sunday, November 12, 1899, by George Harris, a Plimpton Township farm laborer who had been walking eastward along the tracks into town. Upon his grisly discovery, Harris ran into town and reported it to Forest train station agent R.J. Parker. I don't have time to go into all the details, and there are quite a few more details, but I'm limited here. But the essentials are that the body was brought into Forest, where Dr. James Hutton performed the autopsy, and Dr. James Hutton was a very famous doctor in town. So Dr. Hutton concluded from his exam that the poor soul had been attacked with a sharp instrument, likely a razor, and then bled to death as he attempted to make his way into town. Near where his body was found was an encampment used by tramps. This is not the scene, this is actually from the States here, but it would have looked something similar to this. So witnesses, local farmers and their family members, including 13-year-old Nora Lapham and her friend, 12-year-old Jenny Schooler, said they had seen some men quarreling at the spot on Saturday afternoon. Based on the findings of Dr. Hutton and the witnesses' testimony, Crown Attorney Julius P. Buck decided a crime had been committed and issued the following statement: that a certain man whose name is unknown on or about the 11th of November, 1899, in the township of Plimpton, county of Lambton, unlawfully and with malice aforethought did kill and murder a certain other man, whose name also was unknown, contrary to the Criminal Code, 1892, Section 231. Following the post-mortem, the body was taken to the undertakers to prepare for burial at Beechwood Cemetery in Forest. Sarnia Police Detective John Yorrell was then recruited to carry out the investigation to determine both who the culprit or culprits were, and also, of course, the identity of the victim. What seemed like a good lead as to the identity of the victim came from a Mrs. Margaret Plunkett of Ottawa, who contacted Detective Yorrell and told him that the description of the victim she had read in the newspaper closely matched that of her brother, George Kirkwood. And this did get in papers from here to Ottawa, at least, apparently. So indeed, the resemblance included the fact that, like the victim, her brother, George, had a cataract in his left eye. Mrs. Plunkett informed the police that George, age 24, was a shantyman who had left Ottawa to work in the Georgian Bay lumber camps 2 years previously. She hadn't heard of him since, except for a postcard written by him the week before and mailed from Dyers Bay on Saturday, the day before the body was found. She said her brother told her he would be passing through Forest on the way to visit their brother in Windsor. As Mrs. Plunkett herself questioned, it would have been quite difficult for George to have mailed the postcard on the Saturday and travel the 175 miles to Forest by the next day. There was the possibility, of course, that someone else had mailed the postcard for George. Additional tips came in from people in Park Hill and Forest who said they had on the Saturday served meals to a stranger who told them he was bound for Windsor to see his brother and also that he was from Ottawa. So was the victim of the crime indeed George Kirkwood? I cannot say for certain. The body was never positively identified before it was buried. And I should mention here, back in those days, you might think, what about DNA? Well, no, they didn't know anything about DNA in those days. What about fingerprinting? Fingerprinting was just a new idea at the time, and it really hadn't come up to Sarnia to be used by, to Canada to be used by police and so on. So the body was never positively identified before it was buried. The other day, I managed to locate the unmarked grave of the only burial in Beechwood Cemetery for which the records list is that of an unknown person. I believe the person buried at the spot is the murdered man, and there's no marker there whatsoever. Okay. But is it George Kirkwood? In an attempt to see if I could learn additional information about George, I did a search online for family trees that included him on them and found two. One which states that George did not die in 1899, but rather that he lived to the age of 74. The other one, however, indicates that George was indeed the murdered man. So one family tree says, no, it wasn't him. I've actually been in touch with the great-grandson of Mrs. Margaret Plunkett, George's sister here. And so on their family tree, he lived till 74. The other family tree, though, says that no, George was the murdered man who died in 1899. And so I'm waiting to hear from that family to see if they can tell me any more on the information they have. Okay. Now, I'll just back up here. With regard to the search for the culprits, just before Christmas, 1899, a couple of men matching the descriptions of the tramps believed to have been involved in the killing were arrested in Goderich and brought to Forest and remanded for trial. The trial did not happen, though, as the men were released due to a lack of sufficient evidence upon which to base a prosecution. In those days, you really needed direct evidence, witness testimony, if you really wanted to convict somebody, or convincing circumstantial evidence. And I guess they felt they didn't have enough. So the men were released. Thus, the case remains cold. No one was ever convicted of the murder, and the victim was never positively identified. I do wonder, maybe somebody out there can tell me if that body could be exhumed, if they could extract DNA from it, if that would be possible still to identify the body. I don't know. It would be a very expensive undertaking for sure, though. Anyways, so thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Wow, that was a fascinating mystery. Hopefully the family gets back to you and you can piece some details together. Our second last presenter is Kailyn Shepley, curator at Sombra Museum. She has been in this position since 2017. Her educational background is in languages and history, and she's currently completing a program in museum studies. Last year, Kailyn co-authored her first children's book based on experiences at Sombra Museum. Kailyn, go ahead.
Hey everyone, I'm just going to share my screen here. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
I'll be talking about rum running on the St. Clair River. So to start off, what is rum running and why did it happen? So in 1919, the American government passed the Volstead Act, making the production, import, sale, and consumption of liquor or alcohol illegal in the United States as of January 1st, 1920. This was meant to decrease immoral behaviors reportedly induced by the consumption of alcohol and create a more wholesome society and reduce moral corruption. The opposite came to pass, with prohibition giving rise to the wild age of the Roaring Twenties, marked by flappers, speakeasies, jazz, and an increase in alcohol consumption by men and women. This last was also the reason for the rise of North America's largest and most vicious crime syndicate, one of the most notorious leader of these syndicates being Al Capone. This is where bootleggers or rum runners come into play. In Canada, the War Measures Act had banned the sale and consumption of alcohol from 1918 to 1920. It didn't, however, ban the production and export of alcohol, so Canadian distilleries and breweries continued to operate. Indeed, for most of the 1920s, Canadian shipments of alcohol to Cuba, Bermuda, Mexico, and the Dominican Republic occurred at a blistering pace, since export to the U.S. was illegal. Sometimes the same boat would even make 2 or 3 trips a night to Cuba via the St. Clair or Detroit rivers. It is estimated that 80% of alcohol exports from Canada to the U.S. during Prohibition era passed over the Detroit River via pipeline or boat. A large portion of the rest via the St. Clair River, which around Sombra and Fort Lambton is less than 1 kilometer wide, decreasing the length of the trip and the likelihood of being caught. So here we have a map of southern Ontario, and as you can see, we have Sombra and Fort Lambton as the river narrows and it widens into Lake St. Clair and then narrows at the Detroit River. As you can see, it would be very easy to go across quickly. So rum running was lucrative for those involved. It was a way for local families to feed their families as there was a lack of work. According to estimates, in a good summer month, 39,000 cases of beer passed through Lambton County bound for the U.S., along with large quantities of spirits. And although a bottle of beer might have cost 75 cents normally, a case of 24 could sell for $150 stateside. But where did the beer and liquor come from? Most of the supply was shipped in by rail from Montreal. The Père Marquette rail line ran through Sombra and Fort Lambton and would deliver an order to a local runner, usually placed in the name of a deceased person. The breweries, such as Sarnia Brewery, also had their own legal export scows, which were small buildings or boathouses on the water. This here is the former Port Lambton bakery, and it had served as a scow over the water before being moved inland and turned into a bakery. Boats for transporting the booze were called whiskey barges. Locals would go to the local brewery and transport a load by car, truck, even wagon to a scow and store it there, and then a runner would pick it up, usually in the dead of night, and take it to the U.S. It was said that there were 17 scows in the Lambton district, 6 at Fort Lambton, 4 at Sombra, and 1 north of Sombra near Courtright. Other reports say that Fort Lambton alone had 11 scows by the mid-1920s. This was very dangerous work. There were often shootouts on the river between customs officers from the U.S. and Canadian governments and the rum runners. Men held at gunpoint would be robbed of their profits, and sometimes things even turned deadly. The islands and cuts along the South St. Clair were perfect hiding spots for boats to wait until the patrols had either passed by or went after decoy speedboats before completing the crossing. Even in winter, paths were set across the river, and then vehicles, horses, and cargo could be covered in white sheets for camouflage against the snow to make the trek. This was witnessed by one night firsthand by Mrs. Bunny Clark when she was a young girl in the mid-1920s. One of these winter routes was across from the Anthony property, which is just south of Leland Gardens on the St. Clair Parkway, north of Fort Lambton Village. Even women would get involved in the running, hiding flasks in their underwear, on their leg, or in a baby carriage, and even accompanying men on the journey, as did Mrs. Pearl Harrington of Sombra, who accompanied her brother one fateful night on a journey across Lake St. Clair. Their car went through the ice near Walpole Island during the trip, and one of them drowned. It's not sure who, but this is according to Mrs. Bunny Clark. I also mentioned gangsters. The Purple Gang of Detroit was a very violent gang. It was known to make an appearance near Fort Lambton. Al Capone himself, the famous Chicago gangster, frequented the Grand Union Hotel in Sombra, both for business and relaxation. In fact, my own great-grandmother, Evelyn Barcroft Thomas, was a barmaid at the time and was given the nickname Effie by Scarface himself. These lucrative and exciting times came to an end in 1933 when Prohibition was repealed and alcohol was once again legal in the U.S. The stories of those days have lived on from those who were there and witnessed Sombra Township's descent into a decade of smuggling and infamy. Now I'll share some of the local stories and accounts of rum running. So we have this here, Mr. Branton, Mr. Gord Branton, who was the warden of Lambton County at one point. He says that the schooner E.J. McVeigh retired and began to fall apart at the Sombra ferry dock. And folks such as Mr. Grant of Grant's store on the St. Clair Parkway, who bought a box truck for the purpose of rum running. He made regular runs to the Sarnia brewery and would pick up a truck full of fresh beer and load it onto the McVeigh, where it would shortly disappear. Okay, my slide has disappeared. In October 1922, the Maud was carrying 800 cases of whiskey when it departed Fort Lambton for South America. It headed south onto Lake St. Clair, where a storm was blowing up. Waves loosened the caulk on the hull, the bilge filled with water, and it soon sank. The crew was rescued, but all cargo was lost. Mr. Floyd McPhail, a local mechanic, normally charged $75 an hour to work on cars and boats. However, for a rum runner, he would charge $4 to $5 an hour, and he said they had some pretty sweet motors on their crafts. Gord Branton also remembers rum runners replacing car cushions with whiskey bottles, and many buying old jalopies to haul liquor over the ice during the winter so that they didn't have to worry about losing the family car if the ice is too thin. He also remembers the authorities coming to arrest Vet Brown, an American rum runner who shot American Customs officer Earl Roberts in March of 1929. Roberts and his partner in a U.S. Border Patrol boat, such as the Black Maria, which is pictured, had pulled up to Mr. Brown's barge to arrest him. He shot Mr. Roberts unprovoked. Mr. Roberts fell into his boat, and he raced to the Canadian shore and dumped Mr. Roberts' body on the dock at Fort Lambton and told him callously to crawl to the doctor. He was found and taken to Dr. Cathcart, and Dr. Cathcart and two other men transported him to the hospital in Chatham, Kent, where the next day he died. Before he died, he was, however, able to identify his shooter and the circumstances of the event, and he did confess that he had not shot first, and that Mr. Brown had attacked him unprovoked. Mr. Brown was later arrested and was convicted of murder and sent to prison in Michigan in 1947. A couple other stories that we have, courtesy of A History of Sombra Township by Maud Dalgetty. An amusing story about a farmer. He picked up his order of booze at the railway station and took it up to the corner of the 12th concession, or bent path line, where a boat was waiting. Before he let them unload, he demanded his money. They paid him, unloaded his wagon, then pulled a gun on him and demanded their money back. He went home wiser and poorer, but that ended his purchasing of liquor for the rum runners. In 1926, there were 11 to 13 beer scows at Fort Lambton. The assessor made a special trip to Fort Lambton for the purpose of assessing the beer scows, which had been doing business for the 4 or 5 previous years without contributing to the township treasury by way of taxation. One of the village trustees asked the scow owners to contribute toward the upkeep of the roads, which were being used to transfer their goods by wagon and truck from the railway station. The idea met with fierce backlash. On the grounds that the county council at Front Street formed part of the river road, which was a county road and not a township road. So, to conclude, Sombra has a long history of rum running, and we played an integral part in this period of history. This photo is of a boat and kegs that were donated to the BIA in 1999 here in Sombra, and were part of a display with a plaque that remained in the village until for at least 10 years. It's not really sure what happened to it at this point, but it was a proud marker on the local walking tour map for several years. So that's everything. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Kailyn. So our final presenter tonight is Professor Greg Stott. Greg currently teaches history at the University College of the North out of Thompson, Manitoba. He grew up in Arkona and has published studies on Arkona, Port Franks, and Whittier. Greg, go ahead.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I just want to make mention of the fact that I'm going to be dealing with some, one case in particular is quite disturbing, involving sexual assault. So I just wanted everyone to be aware of that. In the spring of 1867, Arkona had been beset by a series of crimes that transgressed the public peace. The incident that most unsettled community members occurred in late March 1867. As the London Advertiser reported, quote, an unknown man on the evening of March 21st attacked a girl named Tyndall near Arkona as she was returning home from school and violated her person. The inhuman wretch escaped, and although detectives had been in pursuit of him, he has eluded them so far, unquote. The area of the attack occurred probably just south of the village. Young Miss Tyndall probably attended SS number 8, Warwick Township, which was right here. This would be the current junction of the Arkona Road and Burnham line. The 15-year-old victim was Anne Elizabeth Tyndall. She was the 4th child and only daughter of Thomas and Jane Tyndall, who farmed south of Arkona in Warwick Township. After several days, the detectives were able to track down the perpetrator. As the Observer out of Sarnia reported, quote, on the 5th of April, a man named Simon McLaughlin was charged before T.F. Eastman and Stephen Cornell Esquire based on the oath of Anne Elizabeth Tyndall and others, with assault with intent to commit rape on the person of the said Tyndall. He was also committed for trial at the ensuing assize. And it should be noted here, sexual assault was unfortunately more common than we probably want to admit. It probably goes without saying that most of these cases went unreported. I found a series of documents relating to the community of Whittier to the north of Arkona, which was ultimately became superseded by Thetford, of many farm women and women who received the unwanted attentions of some lecherous individuals during that time. So sadly, it was not an uncommon reality in the 19th century. At the May sitting of the county court, the assembled jury and justices were informed that McLaughlin, who is alternatively identified as Simeon McLaughlin, was, quote, charged with the assault with the intent to commit rape on the person of Miss Tyndall near Arkona, and they changed the date, the 26th of March last, unquote. The prisoner pleaded not guilty, and his counsel put forward the defense that his client was, quote, of unsound mind. However, based on the testimony given by several witnesses, and it must be said, including Tyndall, who was present in the courtroom and was there to confront her attacker, the jury found McLaughlin guilty. He was subsequently sentenced to 6 months in the county jail. Remember this. As the Sarnia Observer reported, the sentence had been, quote, leniently dealt with on account of an alleged tendency to insanity, unquote. Now, the same sitting of the county court in Sarnia dealt with a series of other serious matters in the Arkona community. Sometime during the early hours of April the 8th, 1867, thieves broke into Alex Dickinson's woolen mill. They absconded with 50 yards of cloth that had been fulled and left out on the bars to dry. Once the crime had been discovered, an investigation began immediately. Suspicion quickly fell upon 21-year-old James Patrick, who lived with his parents, Richard and Hannah, on a farm just west of Arkona. A warrant was issued to search his father's barn, where the stolen cloth was ultimately found. It was soon established that Patrick had not worked alone, but had been aided by 16-year-old friends Joseph Utter and Robert Williamson. The three youths had collectively perpetrated the theft at the instigation of Henry Smith. A native of New York and a member of the Anglican Church, Smith was older than his co-conspirators at the age of 25. According to Patrick, Utter, and Williamson, Smith had reasoned that suspicion was more likely to fall upon him than his three more youthful accomplices, so he remained aloof from the actual theft. He didn't actually participate in the theft itself. This plan also apparently had the added advantage of providing Smith, who, quote, kept out of the way, with a potential alibi. And he believed that there would be therefore no proof of his involvement in the crime. However, this alibi was ultimately foiled. Both Utter and Williamson entered guilty pleas upon their arraignment and subsequently testified at Patrick's trial, providing full particulars as to the way in which the theft was planned and ultimately carried out. They not only implicated Patrick, but they also, of course, implicated Smith. And they noted that, quote, the plunder was to be divided or sold and the money divided, and that Smith was to be given a share of it, unquote. Upon this evidence, Patrick was found guilty and Smith's trial was conducted later that same day. Like Patrick, Smith entered a plea of not guilty. The Crown charged that while Smith may not have actually participated directly in the theft, he was an accomplice and thereby was, quote, equally guilty and liable to be treated exactly in the same way as if he had actually participated in the theft, unquote. Given the evidence presented at the earlier trial of Patrick by Dickinson, Utter, and Williamson, Smith's assertion of innocence was seriously challenged. A reporter for The Observer out of Sarnia noted, quote, the only point in the prisoner's favor was that the proof of his connection with the affair came solely from those who were accomplices, unquote. From the perspective of the jurors, however, since Utter and Williamson, quote, gave their testimony in a straightforward manner, there could be little doubt that he was the prime mover in the theft, but was too cowardly to take part in it himself, unquote. As a result, the jury returned a verdict of guilty. The Observer concluded that Smith, quote, was subsequently charged with stealing a silver watch from the shop of George M. Everest, Arkona, in February last. And from evidence, it appeared that he had played the same game in this affair as in that of stealing the cloth, having planned it and got Joseph Utter, his younger brother Francis Utter, and Robert Williamson to carry it out. 2 watches and the cases of 2 others were stolen on this occasion. The circumstances being so fully detailed by the Utters and Williamson as to leave no doubt as to Smith's guilt. The jury rendered a guilty verdict accordingly, unquote. Robert Williamson, Joseph Utter, and Francis Utter, who was actually 15 at the time, were all sentenced to 3 years in the provincial reformatory in Penetanguishene. Due to, quote, his more advanced age, unquote, James Patrick was sentenced to 2 years in the provincial penitentiary in Kingston. Finally, Henry Smith, the instigator of the thefts and the, quote, corrupter of youth, unquote, was severely reprimanded and sentenced to 2 years for the stolen watches and an additional 3 years for his involvement in the cloth theft, for a total of 5 years in prison. And I think this is interesting. Those who violated property rights apparently merited stiffer penalties than those who attacked young women. Both of the Utter brothers were back in Arkona by 1871, while James Patrick and his parents and sister left the Arkona area for Michigan by 1870. Robert Williamson solidified his connections with the Utter family by marrying his co-conspirator's sister, Mary Jane, before also departing for Michigan. Although he had been trained as a blacksmith, Joseph Utter found work in the winters in the rough and tumble camps of northern Michigan. He continued to return to Arkona in the spring, where he worked for a local wagon maker and eventually developed an attachment to a local girl. However, she married while he was away one winter and removed permanently to Michigan. As for the much maligned Henry Smith, he would not survive his incarceration, dying at the age of 28 in the Kingston Penitentiary in June of 1870 after battling pulmonary consumption for over 100 days. Although Francis Utter was not directly involved in the theft from the woolen mill, he had been involved in the theft of watches. And in light of this history and his associations, he took a bold step in 1879 and married Thomasina Dickinson, daughter of the woolen miller's wronged proprietor, which I think is rather interesting. As for poor Miss Tyndall, I haven't been able to establish exactly what happened to her. Her family also moved to Michigan in the late 1870s. And the last record I could find of her, she was still living with her parents and was unmarried. I often wonder, was she horribly scarred? Understandably, was probably traumatized by her ordeal, and to what degree that shaped the rest of her life is unfortunately anyone's guess. But this is a photograph of the woolen mill much later in the beginning of the 20th century, and this map shows the approximate location of the woolen mill in Arkona. It is in the what would now be the eastern portions of the village on the Townsend line. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Greg. Wow. So before addressing any questions, you can put them into the Q&A box or in the chat box there, if you can think of any. I'm just going to go over a few updates from our community museums across Lambton County. All of our facilities do still remain closed under the provincial reopening plan, but we are busy behind the scenes. Lambton Heritage Museum is looking forward to welcoming visitors back later this summer when the province of Ontario moves to step 3 in the reopening plan. Until then, you can join them next week online on Thursday, June 24th at 7 p.m. for a virtual talk entitled Invasive Species in Your Backyard. Join them as Pioneering Provincial Parks Senior Park Interpreter, Nicole explores the many invasive species that have infiltrated our landscape. Pre-registration is required, but it's free and it's available now on the website. When Lambton Heritage Museum can reopen, they will have a few new feature exhibits. The first one is called Naiji Wayman, We Are Coming Home, and it is a response to the 25th anniversary of the Ipperwash crisis in 1995 and the death of Dudley George. Using interviews, maps, moving images, soundscapes, and wampum, it illustrates the relationship between people, land, and Anishinaabe nationhood. Additionally, the North Lambton Quilters Guild is hosting its biannual quilt show. And lastly, Lambton Heritage Museum is looking forward to presenting the Paint Ontario Art Show and Sale in September. Although Moore Museum remains closed to the public at this time, staff are now returned to the site and begin preparing for reopening. They look forward to being able to welcome you back in person when they can do so safely, hopefully later this summer. In the meantime, they invite you to explore the historical information available on the museum's website, mooremuseum.ca, and to follow them on their Facebook page and Instagram at Moore Museum. If you would like more information, please contact Moore Museum through the Contact Us page on their website or by calling the museum. Forest Museum is thrilled to announce that 3 of the silent film era movie posters discovered at the museum in 2019 have been professionally restored, and they hope to have them on display soon. They would like to let everyone know that they are continuing to work hard, preparing for the day when they can reopen their doors for visitors. Lambton County Archives will be hosting an Ancestry Library workshop on July 13th, so you can check out the website for details when they become available. And the Oil Museum of Canada has been undergoing renovations since January, and we do anticipate reopening later this summer with a renewed building and a refreshed main exhibition. We look forward to welcoming you back in person soon. So I'm wondering if there's any other questions that have come through while I was reading that. I don't see anything, just lots of comments about people enjoying the presentation tonight. So interesting topics. We got a thumbs up.
There's a couple in the Q&A, Erin.
David did respond to that one. Will be transcripts available? Oh, that's a good question. I don't believe we do transcripts. But if you watch it on YouTube, you can turn on captions and then read it that way. It's a very good question. I think that's about it. Okay. We have gone over a few minutes, so I'll wrap it up. On behalf of the Heritage Sarnia-Lambton Museum Network, thank you for attending tonight and continuing to support your local museums. Your support is crucial in allowing us to continue preserving and sharing our local history and the stories of our community. We hope to see you again for our next and final Heritage Hour talk in October for this year. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.